My name is Hazel. I'm 28 now, but the course of my life veered dramatically off track during what was meant to be a simple family road trip to Colorado. What began as a so called funny prank, my family leaving me behind at a gas station in rural Wyoming, turned out to be the pivotal moment that changed everything. Let's see if she can find her way back. They laughed from the car as it pulled away, the dust clouds swirling in there. But I never did return. Not that day, not for the next 16 years. By the time they found me again, I had become someone completely different from the girl they once abandoned. Before I take you through everything that happened next, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Hit that subscribe button if you're ready to hear how getting left behind ended up being the very thing that set me free. Growing up in the Reynolds household meant mastering the art of emotional armor. My parents, Barbara and Richard, had somehow convinced themselves that teasing their children to the point of humiliation was character building. My two older brothers, Brett and Craig, absorbed that philosophy like gospel. In our family, someone always had to be the punchline, and more often than not, that person was me. Our family photo albums are full of carefully posed smiles, but behind the laughter were endless moments that left me feeling ridiculed and small. Take my 10th birthday, for example. They tricked me into thinking no one was coming. I spent hours crying alone, only for everyone to burst in, shouting, "Surprise!" as if that erased the emotional damage. At my middle school graduation, they all pretended to forget, only to show up deliberately late. And prom night, they gave my date the wrong address. Over and over, these events ended with the same dismissive chorus. "Come on, Hazel, can't you take a joke?" Mom had her own way of cutting deep. Her comments came cloaked in false concern or thinly veiled compliments. "That dress would look amazing on you if you lost 15 pounds." Or, "Your face could be pretty if you smiled more and fixed your skin." Dad, on the other hand, was blunt. He didn't offer critiques. He just laughed the hardest when my brothers pranked me. Brett, the eldest at 32, worked alongside Dad at his insurance firm and was being groomed as the heir apparent. Craig, 30, was in charge of the marketing side of the business. Both had inherited the same warped idea that emotional torment was a form of bonding. Dinner conversations often revolved around detailed retellings of their latest hilarious pranks on coworkers, friends, even strangers. Just 3 weeks before the trip that changed everything, I had graduated college with a degree in graphic design. The unspoken plan was that I'd work for the family company, handling their design needs. I had voiced my interest in applying to creative agencies in Chicago, the city I'd studied and lived in for years. But my parents scoffed at the idea. "You can do your little art projects for us," Mom had said at my graduation dinner. "They'll be way more stable than chasing some silly dream." Finances made breaking away difficult. I was saddled with student loans, and my parents still covered my apartment rent, a gesture they constantly reminded me could vanish if I didn't show enough gratitude. I had a part-time job at a coffee shop, but it wasn't nearly enough to live on. So when they announced a celebration trip to Colorado, I forced myself to hope it might be a turning point. A week in a rented cabin near Rocky Mountain National Park. Maybe, just maybe, they were trying to reconnect. From the moment we crammed into the family SUV, tension simmered beneath the surface. "Did you remember to bring your brain this time, Hazel?" Craig smirked as I hoisted in my suitcase. "Remember Florida? When she forgot her swimsuit?" I was 16 back then. They refused to stop so I could buy another, then mocked me for spending 3 beach-filled days fully dressed. The first day of driving played out like a greatest hits reel of minor torment. Brett accidentally pocketed my phone and watched me freak out before dramatically pulling it out with a grin. Craig polished off the sandwich I'd packed for myself while I napped. Dad took a wrong turn, blamed my map reading, and acted like it was no big deal. None of this was new. But familiarity didn't soften the sting. That night, in a motel room in Nebraska, I overheard them through the paper-thin wall. "She's just too sensitive," Mom sighed. The real world's going to eat her alive if she doesn't toughen up. Maybe this trip will finally teach her not to be such a pushover, Dad responded. I went to bed with a pit in my stomach, whispering to myself, just 5 more days. Then I could go home, apply for jobs, and start my life on my own terms. I had no idea how prophetic that thought would be, or that the next day would mark the last time I'd ever travel with my family. The second day started off oddly peaceful. Looking back, I should have known it was the calm before a storm. When they were being nice, it usually meant something cruel was brewing. Around midday, we crossed from Nebraska into Wyoming. The scenery morphed into endless plains, distant hills, breaking the horizon. We need to fill up, Dad said as we neared a small, dusty town called Pinneridge. He pulled into a tiny, locally owned gas station on the town's edge, flanked by 3 sides of empty fields. It had an old convenience store attached, the kind with flickering lights and dusty windows. I'm gonna use the restroom and grab some snacks, I said, stepping out as Dad began to pump gas. Anyone want anything? Coke, Brett muttered, eyes glued to his phone. Beef jerky, Craig added without looking up. Mom was too busy reapplying her lipstick in the visor mirror to answer. Inside, the store was quiet. I used the restroom, then browsed the shelves slowly, collecting what they asked for and a few things for myself, a bottle of water, some chips. The place felt frozen in time. At the register stood a woman, maybe in her 40s, with kind eyes and a name tag that read Miranda. You folks just passing through? She asked with a warm smile as she handed me my change. Yeah, heading to Colorado for vacation, I said with a friendly smile. Well, enjoy your trip, Miranda replied. Her words were so ordinary, the kind of phrase you hear 100 times and never think twice about. But for me, they would echo in my memory for years to come, because they were the last normal words I'd hear before everything unraveled. I pushed open the convenience store door, snacks bundled in my arms, expecting to find our SUV idling where we'd parked. Instead, I froze. The space was empty. Gone. I blinked in confusion, half convinced I'd exited through the wrong door or taken a wrong turn, but a slow walk around the entire lot confirmed the unthinkable. My family had vanished. My first instinct was denial. Maybe Dad had just pulled around to the air pump, or maybe they'd parked on the far side of the building. I paced the perimeter, searching corners, squinting down the road. Nothing. They probably went to that sandwich shop I saw on the way in. I mumbled to myself, trying to stay calm, even as my gut twisted with dread. I pulled out my phone and called Dad. It rang until voicemail picked up. I tried Mom next. Same. Then Brett. No answer. Finally, Craig picked up on the 4th ring. Where are you guys? I asked, forcing my voice to stay steady. Laughter echoed in the background. Oh, about 20 minutes down the highway now, Craig said, barely containing his amusement. My chest tightened. What? Turn around and come get me. Let's see if she can find her way back on her own, Brett shouted in the background, his voice gleeful. This isn't funny, I snapped, panic rising. Tell Dad to come back right now. Craig chuckled. Check your messages, he said, and hung up. A notification popped up. Brett had sent a photo, all of them grinning in the car, clearly enjoying themselves. The caption read, Survival of the fittest, sis. Find your way home. Called again. Voicemail? Again. And again. One by one, each number went straight to voicemail. I had been blocked. There I stood, in a town I didn't know, in a state I had never visited before under the unforgiving Wyoming sun. They had abandoned me, not as a joke, but deliberately. I looked down at my purse, $43, 0 cents in cash, a debit card with maybe a couple $100 in the account, and my ID. My suitcase, all my clothes, toiletries, everything was still in the back of the SUV. My phone's battery was already dipping below 20%. As the hours passed, I sat on the curb, emotions swirling, shock, fear, then anger. I kept checking my phone, half hoping this was all a twisted prank and they'd soon return. But instead of apologies, another image arrived in the family group chat. Them laughing over dinner at a restaurant. Wonder if Hazel found dinner yet? Read the caption. Followed by a string of laughing emojis. Around sunset, Miranda stepped outside to lock up. Her eyes fell on me, still perched on the curb, my face blotchy from tears. Honey, you've been sitting out here for 3 hours, she said gently. Are you all right? The kindness in her voice broke the dam. Through tears, I told her everything. How my family thought it was funny to abandon me. How this wasn't even the first time they'd done something like this, just the most extreme. They left you here? On purpose? Her disbelief mirrored my own. They call it character building, I said, wiping my eyes. It's just another joke to them. Well, do you have anyone to call? Friends, maybe? I shook my head. My closest friend had just moved to California. I didn't know anyone who could drive across the country to help. That realization hit harder than expected. My family had kept me isolated for years, subtly discouraging deep friendships, ensuring I remained dependent on them. Night began to settle over the quiet town, the air cooling quickly. My phone was down to 8% battery. Desperate, I made one more call, and to my surprise, Dad answered. Have you learned your lesson yet? He said coldly. What lesson? My voice cracked from crying. That you can't always count on other people, not even family. What am I supposed to do? I asked, panic rising again. I don't have money. I don't have a place to stay. You're smart. Get creative, he replied, then hung up. Staring at my screen, I watched the battery blink out, the final message from my mother appearing just before the phone died. This is for your own good, Hazel. You need to learn self-reliance. Miranda, having overheard enough of the call, stepped closer. I know someone who rents a room out in town. Her name's Eleanor. Let me give her a call. With darkness surrounding the lonely gas station, I realized I had a choice. Try to return to the people who had discarded me without remorse, or take my first steps towards something entirely different. Eleanor was a silver-haired woman in her 60s with a gentle demeanor and a yellow house 3 blocks from Main Street. Her spare bedroom was modest, a twin bed, a dresser, a small desk, but it was the first place that had felt remotely safe all day. Miranda told me what happened. Eleanor said softly as she showed me around. You can stay tonight. We'll figure out next steps in the morning. She lent me a nightgown and a travel kit of toiletries. That night, in a strange bed in a stranger's house, I cried until my body couldn't produce another tear. Some part of me still believed my phone would buzz with a text or call. My family, realizing the cruelty of what they'd done, begging me to forgive them. But morning came and the silence remained. Eleanor let me use her landline. I called my parents' number, the one etched into my memory since childhood. No answer. I called the family business. The receptionist answered politely, said my parents and brothers were in a meeting, and promised to pass along my message. They never called back. I stared at the kitchen table, the phone still in my hand. I needed to charge my own phone. I needed to check my bank account, but more than anything, I needed to decide what to do next, now that the people who were supposed to love me the most had left me behind without looking back. Over a modest breakfast of toast and scrambled eggs that Eleanor had kindly prepared, I finally voiced what had been gnawing at me since the day I was left behind. I need to find a way back to Chicago, I said quietly. But later that morning, when I managed to get my phone powered back on, the messages that greeted me only deepened the growing realization that this so-called prank wasn't going to end anytime soon. Day 2 of Hazel's big adventure read Brett's text, accompanied by a photo of the family smiling mid-hike in the Colorado wilderness. Craig had added his own touch with a message that read, "You started hitchhiking yet?" but the worst was from my father. Called your apartment manager. Rent's not being paid while you're figuring this out. Consider that motivation. And as if that weren't cruel enough, my mother's contribution came in the form of a chilling note. This is what tough love looks like, honey. You'll understand someday. I checked my bank account, just $237.42, not even enough for a bus ticket back to Chicago, let alone enough to cover first and last month's rent. If I wanted to live on my own again. The weight of that number sat like a stone in my chest. Eleanor found me on the front porch of her home, staring numbly at my screen. Bad news? She asked gently, kneeling beside me. They're not coming back, I said, barely above a whisper, and they've stopped paying for my apartment. I don't have anything to return to. Instead of pity, which I braced for, Eleanor's expression shifted into something stronger. Resolve. Then stay here, she said firmly. At least until you figure out your next move. She offered me the spare room for $300.00 a month, but instead of insisting I pay right away, she proposed I help out at her bookstore, Pages and Poems, located just off Main Street, to cover my stay. It's not glamorous and doesn't pay much, she admitted, but I could use the help. That very afternoon, she gave me a tour of the small, cozy bookstore she had run for more than 30 years. It was full of charm, but also clearly struggling. The signage was dated, and its website was a relic from the early 2000s, designed by a nephew who'd long since moved on. Also need a real job, I told her, something that pays. I need to eat, save, figure out what's next. The following morning, I canvassed every single business in downtown Pine Ridge, asking for work. By sunset, I had secured a waitressing position at the Pinewood Diner. The hours were rough, breakfast and lunch shifts, 6 days a week, but it was income. My first week blurred by in a haze of aching feet, mental fog, and sporadic bouts of crying when no one was watching. I'd work at the diner from 6 o'clock a.m. to 2 o'clock p.m., take a quick rest, then help Eleanor at the bookstore until closing. Each night, I'd still check my phone. Each night, I'd hold out a tiny hope that someone had come to their senses. But the messages grew more infrequent and increasingly indifferent. Still waiting on that call saying you made it home, my dad texted on the 5th day. By the second week, the messages stopped altogether. One afternoon, my coworker Amber found me curled up in the break room, quietly crying after another long shift. She was 25, a single mom, juggling 2 jobs, and when she sat beside me, I could tell she recognized the look in my eyes. Family trouble, she asked. Something about her tone made me open up. I told her everything. The years of cruel jokes, the abandonment, the mocking texts. I laid it all bare. When I finished, she sat in silence for a long moment before finally saying something that would forever shift my thinking. You know, sounds like they did you a favor by leaving you here. What? I blinked, confused. Those aren't pranks, Hazel. That's abuse. And now, for the first time, you've got a shot at building something for yourself without them dragging you down. That night, I lay awake in Eleanor's spare bed and thought about what Amber had said. She was right. I didn't want to go back. Not to people who had made it abundantly clear that my value only existed in the context of their entertainment. The next day, I used the computer in Eleanor's bookstore to email my college professors, explaining my situation and asking for letters of recommendation. I created a new email address, one my family couldn't track, and started researching how to replace my ID and essential documents that were still locked inside my old apartment. You're good with design, right? Eleanor asked one evening as we tidied up the shop. I could really use some new flyers, maybe someone to handle the store's social media. It was the first time since graduation that anyone had given me a chance to actually use my degree. I jumped on it. I created a fresh, modern flyer for an upcoming local author event. Eleanor was thrilled. You should meet Mason, she said the next day. He does web development for businesses around here. Might have something for you. Mason turned out to be a kind eyed man in his 30s with a full beard and a relaxed energy. He worked remotely for tech firms, but had settled in Pine Ridge for the quiet life and hiking trails. When I showed him my design portfolio from college, he nodded appreciatively. I could use someone like you, he said. I'm terrible with visuals. Maybe you could help with the front end stuff on some client projects. He even offered to teach me basic coding, suggesting that learning both sides of the process would make me more valuable. It was the first time in weeks I'd felt more than just functional. I felt capable. I felt like I had potential. While my family had expected me to fail, to come crawling back humbled and apologetic, I was instead building a life they weren't part of. As my first month in Pina Ridge came to a close, I received one final text from my mother. This silence is very immature, Hazel. Call us when you've grown up. I didn't reply. I blocked every number. And then I turned my attention forward, toward my life. Penridge's downtown spanned only about 4 blocks. The Pinewood Diner sat on one end, while Pages and Poems anchored the other. Between those two places, I became a regular fixture. No one asked if I was just passing through anymore. They greeted me with familiarity. Morning, Hazel, became a daily melody as I made my way from one job to the other. My first real design project since graduating was rebuilding Eleanor's bookstore website. With Mason's help in the evenings, I revamped it completely, adding a streamlined layout, an online ordering system, and a section highlighting upcoming events and local authors. This is incredible, Eleanor said, misty-eyed as she clicked through the finished site. Sales have gone up 15% since we put up those posters. This? This will help even more. Mason, too, was impressed. You've got a gift for user interface design, he told me during our third coding session. You're picking this up faster than most of my clients do. And for the first time in my life, I believed him. With Eleanor's encouragement, I took on rebuilding the Pages and Poems website from the ground up. I added a sleek, modern design with features the old site sorely lacked, an online ordering system, a calendar of events, and a section that spotlighted local authors. When I finally revealed the finished product to Eleanor, her reaction was immediate and heartfelt. This is incredible, she said, eyes wide with admiration. Business has already gone up 15% just from those posters you designed. This will help even more. Mason, too, was impressed when he saw the interface. You've got a natural talent for UI design, he said after our third coding session together. Honestly, you're picking this up faster than most of the clients I've worked with. At the diner, Amber continued to be my lifeline. One evening, she invited me to meet her circle of friends, a group of young adults who had either grown up in Pine Ridge or had found their way here seeking affordability and community. For the first time in my life, I was forming connections that weren't rooted in obligation or performance. These people didn't expect me to entertain them or serve as the butt of a joke. They liked me for me. During my second month in town, I received an email from my former landlord in Chicago. I'd missed 2 months of rent. They needed to clear the apartment and asked about my plans for the belongings I had left behind. I stared at the message for a long time before replying, I can't afford to come get anything. Please donate what's useful and discard the rest. Sending that email was a mixture of pain and release. Letting go of my old possessions, the ones gifted by my family, felt like severing the last strings they'd attached to me. Those items had always come with subtle reminders how much they'd done for me, how indebted I was. Now I was free to start fresh, no longer bound by those invisible debts. Mason soon introduced me to a small business owner in a neighboring town who needed help with logo design and promotional materials. It became my first freelance project. The pay wasn't high, but the sense of ownership and pride I felt in completing it was unmatched. You should really think about turning this into a full-time thing, Mason said over coffee one morning. There's no proper design agency within 100 miles. All these small businesses are trying to establish an online presence and they need help. You could be the one to give it to them. The idea took root quickly. By my third month in Pinridge, I had 3 regular freelance clients. Combined with my part-time roles at the diner and the bookstore, I'd finally saved enough to move out of Eleanor's spare room. I rented a tiny studio apartment above the local hardware store on Main Street. It was small and a little drafty, but it was mine. The first place I'd ever lived that wasn't conditional on pleasing someone else. On the morning I moved in, I bought a potted succulent as a housewarming gift to myself. As I placed it on the windowsill, I whispered, "This is the first day of your new life. No more looking back." But that same afternoon, my phone rang. The number had a Chicago area code. Thinking it might be something about the apartment or my old bank, I answered. "Hazel, it's Brett. Don't hang up." My grip tightened on the phone. "What do you want?" "We're worried about you," he said, his tone oddly serious. "It's been 3 months. The joke's over." "Where are you?" Hmm. That word, joke, was like a match dropped into dry leaves. I snapped. "You left me stranded in a different state with no money and no way home. You cut off my housing. That's not a joke, Brett. That's cruelty. Come on, we thought you'd find your way back in a week. When you didn't call, we figured you were just being stubborn." "Well, I'm not coming back." "Don't be ridiculous. What are you even doing for money? Where are you living?" The condescension, so familiar, only strengthened my resolve. "I have a job. Actually, I have multiple jobs. I have clients. I have my own apartment. I'm doing fine without any of you." There was a pause. Then he said, "Mom and Dad want to talk to you." "I don't want to talk to them or to you. Don't call me again." I ended the call and immediately blocked the number. Then I sat down on my secondhand couch, shaking not from fear, but from a powerful mix of fury and pride. They had expected me to break, to beg, to return home desperate and apologetic. Instead, I was thriving. I was building a life they never believed I could. Over the next few months, their attempts to reach me grew more creative. They tried calling from unknown numbers, emailed me from new accounts, and even mailed a letter to the diner after someone mentioned I worked there. I ignored them all. By the 6-month mark, I had built up a strong enough freelance base to quit the diner and focus solely on design work and my part-time role with Eleanor. Mason and I had become an informal business team. He handled the coding and back-end development. I focused on visuals and branding. "You know what you should do?" Mason said one evening as we wrapped up a client project. "Register a business, make it official." The next day, I filed the paperwork for New Horizon Design Studio. As my 1-year anniversary in Pinridge approached, I took time to reflect on how drastically things had changed. The girl who had once sobbed on a gas station curb now ran her own business. I had friends, clients, a support system. I had a home. When Eleanor hosted a small gathering at the bookstore to celebrate the 1-year anniversary of my website launch, and privately, my year in town, I looked around at the faces that now made up my life. Amber and her little boy Mason are regular customers. Even Miranda from the gas station. They weren't just acquaintances, they were my chosen family. "To new beginnings," Eleanor toasted, lifting a glass of sparkling cider. "And to finding home," I added, raising mine, "in the place you least expected." It had been 2 years since I was left behind in Penridge, and I had never felt more found. My design business had grown enough that I occasionally traveled to meet with clients in nearby cities. It was during one such trip to Denver that my past carefully avoided and tightly locked away came crashing back into my present. I was seated at a cafe near the 16th Street Mall, preparing for a pitch meeting, when a voice I hadn't heard in years sliced through the ambient hum of conversations and espresso machines. "Hazel, is that you?" I looked up, heart thudding. There, just a few feet away, stood Brett, my brother. His face registered a mix of disbelief and relief. Dressed in a sharp business suit, it was clear he was in Denver for work, just like me. Brett, I managed, my voice surprisingly steady despite the jolt of adrenaline coursing through me. Holy crap, it really is you. Without waiting for permission, he pulled out the chair across from me and sat down. We've been looking for you for over a year. I wasn't lost, I replied calmly, closing my laptop. I made the choice to stay away. His eyes swept over me, noting my polished attire, the professional layout of my materials, and perhaps the confidence I wore like new armor. You look different. I am different, I said, taking a sip of my coffee to hide the tremor in my hands. What are you doing in Denver? Client meeting. And you? Insurance conference, he said. Dad and I are presenting tomorrow. Then he leaned in. Hazel, you need to come home. This has gone on long enough. This isn't a standoff, Brett, I said. This is my life now. I live in Wyoming. I have a business. I have people who care about me. He scoffed, the familiar smirk surfacing. Come on. The dismissiveness in his tone lit a fuse I'd long tried to keep extinguished. Yes. In the same state where you all abandoned me. Remember that? Oh, don't be so dramatic, he said, waving it off. We knew you had your phone. Money. You'd figure it out. I had $43, 0 cents, and a dying phone. I snapped. You canceled my apartment lease? You left me with nothing, Brett. For a brief second, his expression faltered. Look, it got out of hand. We thought you'd come back in a few days, a week at most. When you didn't call, Dad assumed you were staying with friends, that you were trying to teach us a lesson. By the time we realized you were serious, it was already 6 months. And then you started looking for me out of guilt? My tone was sharp with disbelief. Out of concern, he insisted. Mom was worried sick. She couldn't sleep. Really? I asked. Because her last message to me said abandoning me was tough love and that I should grow up. He sighed, clearly growing frustrated. Can we just start over? The family misses you. Dad's retiring next year. He wants to make amends. I laughed, a short, bitter sound. Amends? For a lifetime of cruelty masked as jokes? For leaving me alone in a strange town with no way home? How exactly does he plan to do that? Just come for a visit, Brett pleaded. See everyone. They've changed. My composure cracked. Years of hurt surged to the surface. They haven't changed, Brett. Neither have you. You're sitting here trying to convince me that what you did was justifiable, that I should forgive and forget because it's convenient for you now. My voice rose, drawing glances from nearby tables. I didn't care. Do you have any idea what it felt like to stand in that parking lot, realizing my family considered me disposable? To read those messages, laughing about whether I'd found food, while I was terrified about where I'd sleep that night? Keep your voice down, he hissed. You're making a scene. A scene? I stood, gathering my things. That's what concerns you? Not what you did, just the fact people might hear about it. As I turned to leave, he reached out and grabbed my wrist. You don't get to walk away, he said. The family has been worried. Do you even know what people are saying? There are rumors that you had a breakdown, that you're homeless. Is that really what you want people to think? I yanked my arm free. I don't care what people think. I care about living a life free from manipulation, free from being belittled by the people who were supposed to protect me. You always were too sensitive, Brett snapped, the mask of concern slipping. That's why we had to toughen you up. You fall apart over the smallest things. Criticism? I nearly shouted. You call abandonment criticism? You call emotionally tormenting me, toughening me up? I- If I don't go back willingly, what? You'll make something up? I'll tell everyone what really happened, he said coldly, that you had a meltdown over a joke, that you ran away, that you're ignoring your dying father's attempt to make peace. Does dying? My anger momentarily faltered. He's not in great health, Brett said vaguely, not meeting my eyes. You're lying, I said, more to myself than to him. Again. I turned to leave. Goodbye, Brett. As I walked out of the cafe, he shouted after me. This isn't over, Hazel. The family has a right to know where you are. I made it to my rental car before the tears came, not of sadness, but of fury. The conversation had torn open wounds I thought had long since closed, but it had also made something else crystal clear. I wasn't the one who needed to apologize. I wasn't the one who'd done something unforgivable. I called my client and rescheduled our meeting. Then I drove straight back to Pine Ridge, heart pounding for all 3 hours of the journey. Brett now knew I was in Wyoming. It wouldn't take much digging to figure out exactly where. The next morning, I went to Eleanor's house and told her everything: the meeting, Brett's threats, my fear that my family might try to invade the life I'd fought so hard to build. They can try, Eleanor said, her eyes fierce. But this is your home now, Hazel, and we've got your back. That afternoon, I invited Eleanor, Mason, Amber, and a few close friends to my apartment. Until then, I had only ever hinted at what had happened with my family. But with Brett's reappearance and the threat of renewed interference, it was time to speak plainly. I need you to know everything, I began, my voice firm but steady. Then I shared the full truth: the years of emotional manipulation, the cruel pranks disguised as jokes, and ultimately the moment they abandoned me in a gas station parking lot. I held nothing back. If any of you ever get calls or messages from someone asking about me, I concluded, now you know exactly who they are and why I want no contact. Amber reached over and squeezed my hand. Those people sound toxic as hell, she said, eyes flashing with loyalty. We've got you. They're not getting near you unless you want them to. Their unwavering support fortified something inside me. That night, I sat at my desk and typed out an email, the first time I'd initiated contact with my family in 2 years. It was direct and final. I am safe. I am successful. I have built a life without your cruelty and manipulation. I do not want reconciliation. I do not want contact. Any attempt to force your way back into my life will result in legal action. This is not up for discussion. I hit send. Then I blocked their email addresses again. That night, as I lay in bed, the weight of the encounter with Brett slowly transformed into something clearer. Painful though it had been, it gave me a gift: absolute certainty. I had spent years wondering if I'd been too harsh, if perhaps they'd changed. Now I knew the truth. They were exactly who they'd always been, and I, thankfully, was not. I had become someone stronger, someone who could look betrayal in the eye and say, no more. Someone capable of walking away, not out of weakness, but because she finally understood her worth. The next morning, I awoke with a clarity I hadn't felt since the day I was left behind. I opened my laptop and began designing a new logo for New Horizon Design Studio, one that didn't just reflect a growing business, but a rebirth, a symbol of resilience and reinvention. 5 years after that turning point in Wyoming, I stood in the sunlit offices of New Horizon Design Agency. From its humble beginnings as a survival project, the business had evolved into a respected firm specializing in brand identity and digital strategy for small and mid-sized businesses across the Mountain West. Our renovated second-floor space in downtown Pine Ridge brimmed with energy, the walls adorned with our best work, the large windows framing views of the town I now called home. We just got sign-off from the Denver client, announced Megan, my first full-time employee and now our creative director. They want to move forward with Phase two? That's our third major contract this quarter, I said, unable to contain my pride. Go ahead and schedule a meeting. Let's brainstorm some expanded service options we can pitch them. As I spoke, my phone buzzed with a message from Sam, my partner. We'd met at Pages and Poems when he was searching for books on local history for a course he taught at the community college. Eleanor had introduced us. After months of slow building connection, our friendship had deepened into a love grounded in patience, humor, and mutual respect. Dinner at 7, his text read, making your favorite pasta. Can't wait, I replied, smiling. Bring dessert. By 33, I had built a life that felt genuine and full. My friends were my chosen family. Eleanor was the mother figure I never had. Amber's son, Tyler, called me Auntie Hazel. Mason and I had formed a seamless professional partnership, often collaborating on larger creative projects. 3 months earlier, Sam and I had bought a small craftsman house on the edge of town. It had a sunlit studio space where I could work from home and a backyard where we'd started planting a garden, clumsy but enthusiastic in our attempts to grow herbs and tomatoes. One evening, as I locked up the office, my phone rang from an unknown number. Normally, I'd let it go to voicemail, but with several new client prospects in the pipeline, I answered. Is this Hazel Reynolds of New Horizon Design? Asked a poised female voice. Yes, this is Hazel, I replied. My name's Jennifer Atkins. I'm an editor with Business West magazine. We're running a feature on female entrepreneurs who've built successful businesses in unexpected places. Your agency came highly recommended during our research. That call led to a feature article 3 months later, a 4-page spread that showcased our office, my team, and me standing confidently in front of the business I'd built from scratch. The article chronicled how a young designer had landed in a small Wyoming town and discovered a significant gap in professional design services for rural communities. I kept the most painful details to myself. The abandonment, the estrangement, those were parts of the story the public didn't need. But the article emphasized how I had arrived in Pine Ridge with little more than determination and had built something extraordinary. 2 weeks after the magazine hit shelves, the emails began. One from my mother, it was my father, then both brothers. Subject lines varied. We need to talk. Saw your article. Please respond. I didn't open a single one. I deleted them all. Then came the phone calls, not to me directly, but to the agency. My office manager, following instructions I'd set long ago, handled them with professionalism. Ms. Reynolds does not accept personal calls at this number. I thought that would be the end of it, but I had underestimated Barbara Reynolds. One Tuesday afternoon, I returned from lunch to find her seated in our waiting area. Dressed elegantly, she looked older, but unmistakably familiar. Mom, I said, stunned. How did you find me? She stood, brushing invisible wrinkles from her designer slacks. The magazine article had your business address. As her gaze swept over me, taking in my poised posture and polished appearance, she gave a small nod. You look well. I am, I replied evenly, keeping my expression unreadable. Why are you here? Can we talk privately? Part of me wanted to say no, to send her away with the same coldness I'd once received. But after 5 years of healing, I wasn't afraid anymore. I was curious. What did she possibly have to say now that could change anything? This way, I said, leading her past my staff, who looked on with polite confusion, unaware of who this visitor really was. Inside my office, Barbara paused, her eyes scanning the room. She took in the framed accolades, the sunlight streaming through the window, the signs of a life I'd built from the ground up. This is impressive, she said, voice quieter now. The magazine didn't do it justice. Thank you, I said, remaining standing. But I doubt you came all this way just to admire my office. Her polished composure began to fray. We've been trying to reach you for years. After Brett saw you in Denver, your father hired someone to track you down. But you'd made yourself very difficult to find. I wasn't hiding, I corrected. I was just living. There's a difference. Barbara exhaled slowly. We made a terrible mistake. Her voice faltered. It started as a stupid prank that went too far. And then pride, stubbornness. No one wanted to admit how wrong we were. By the time we truly understood the damage, you were gone. It wasn't just that day, I said quietly. It was the years before. The constant humiliation passed off as humor. The way love was twisted into cruelty, into conditions and tests. You trained me to believe I had to endure pain to earn affection. Tears glistened in her eyes as she pulled a tissue from her bag. I know. I see that now. When we saw the article, you standing confidently running this amazing business, it forced us to face everything, not just what we did in Wyoming, but how we failed you, your entire life. What do you want from me? I asked. An apology? A second chance? She shook her head. I want a chance to know the woman you've become, to be better, if you'll let me. I studied her carefully, looking for the familiar manipulation, but what I saw instead was regret, real, raw, and unfamiliar coming from her. I can't give you what you want, I said gently. Too much has happened. But I can tell you that I'm happy now. I've made a life with people who value me. That has to be enough. Barbara nodded, tears falling freely. Your brothers, they want to see you. Your father, too, though he'd never admit it. I'm not ready, I replied. I may never be, and that needs to be okay. As she turned to go, she paused. You were always the strongest of us, Hazel. We just didn't see it until we lost you. After she left, I sat alone, turning her words over in my mind. There wasn't a cinematic reconciliation, no sudden hug, no flood of forgiveness. But there was something else. The beginning of truth, of being seen. That evening, Sam and I sat together on our porch as the sun dipped behind the hills. How do you feel about it? He asked, arm wrapped around me. I leaned into him. Strangely, peaceful. For so long, I let what they did define me. But today I realized that chapter's closed. I'm not the girl they abandoned. I'm just Hazel, a partner, a business owner, someone who's built a life she's proud of. The next morning, I emailed my mother a single photo, me standing with my team outside the New Horizon office. No message, no invitation, no promises, just proof of who I'd become. And for once, that felt like enough. 16 years after being left behind in a dusty Wyoming parking lot, I stood in my kitchen, holding a certified letter with a return address. From a law firm in Chicago, my heart thudded. I opened it slowly. Dear Miss Reynolds, it began. We represent the estate of Richard and Barbara Reynolds. We are writing to inform you that Reynolds Insurance Group has been sold. As per your parents' instructions, the proceeds are to be divided equally among their 3 children. I sank into a chair, the letter trembling in my hands. The rest contained details about the sale, the sizable amount each sibling would receive, and a request to contact the firm to arrange the transfer. 10 minutes later, Sam came home and found me still seated. What happened? He asked, setting his briefcase down. They sold the business, I said, handing him the letter. They're splitting the money between Brett, Craig, and me. Sam skimmed it, eyebrows raised at the figure. There's more, I added, holding up an unopened envelope enclosed with the documents. A personal letter from my mother. I haven't read it yet. In the years since her visit to my office, our contact had been minimal. A few sparse emails, a Christmas card or two, and now, this. I stared at the envelope, wondering whether I wanted to open a door I'd finally closed. Maybe I would, maybe I wouldn't. But either way, I knew something for certain. I didn't need whatever it contained to validate the life I had built. That life was mine. And it was more than enough. I had long maintained clear, immovable boundaries, gently but firmly pushing back on any overtures toward reconciliation for my family. At the same time, I had acknowledged privately, quietly, the small but visible signs of change. Their tone had softened in the rare emails. The inheritance had been split equally. No attempts had been made to force a reunion. "Do you want me to leave so you can read it alone?" Sam asked, his hand warm on mine. I shook my head. "No, stay, please." The envelope was thick, its paper high quality, with my mother's distinctive handwriting across the front. I opened it carefully. Inside was a letter written on Barbara Reynolds' personal stationery. The first few words alone made my pulse jump. "Dear Hazel," it began, "by the time you receive this, the sale of the business will be finalized. Your father has, at long last, stepped down, albeit reluctantly. His health isn't what it used to be. We're moving to Arizona for the climate and the quiet. Before we leave, we're hosting one final family gathering at the house. Brett and Craig will be there with their families. Brett has 3 children now. Craig got married last year. I know you've kept your distance, and I understand why, but things have changed. Your father may never say it aloud, but the decision to include you in the business proceeds was his. He recognizes in his own way the gravity of what happened all those years ago. We would love for you to attend the gathering. No pressure, no expectations, just a chance to close old chapters before new ones begin. With love, Mom. Attached was a small note with the time, date, and address of the gathering, along with a phone number I didn't recognize, presumably my mother's new cell. I folded the letter and slipped it back into the envelope with slow, deliberate hands. "Are you thinking about going?" Sam asked gently. "I don't know," I admitted, the words weighed with uncertainty. "Part of me is curious. I want to see what 16 years has done to them. Another part of me thinks some doors should stay closed." In the days that followed, the question occupied every quiet moment. New Horizon Design was expanding, with offices now in 3 states. Sam and I had celebrated our 8th wedding anniversary just last month. Our twin daughters, Lily and Emma, had recently turned 6. We lived a life filled with peace and love, anchored in a town that had embraced me. But I kept imagining that gathering. "What would you tell the girls if they ever asked why they've never met your side of the family?" Sam asked one evening as we sat on the porch. It was a fair question. Lily and Emma knew their grandparents in Montana and saw them a couple times a year. But my family? I'd always said they lived far away. I'd tell them, I said slowly, choosing each word with care, that sometimes the people who are supposed to love us the most hurt us in ways that take a long time to heal. But I would also tell them that people can change, that forgiveness doesn't always mean forgetting, but sometimes it means letting go of the pain. "Do you believe your family has changed?" he asked. I thought about the inheritance, the quiet emails over the years, my mother's subdued tone in her letter. I sighed. "I think they've tried. I just don't know if it's enough." After many nights of deliberation, I decided to go on my terms. I booked a hotel room for one night. I would fly in the morning of the gathering and fly back the following day. No sleeping in the house where so much of my pain had been rooted. The house stood unchanged, still wrapped in pristine white siding with black shutters, a symbol of affluent suburban stability. As the Uber pulled up to the curb, I took a steadying breath and walked the familiar path to the front door. My mother answered, her face lighting up with a mixture of joy and restraint. "Hazel, you came." "I did," I said, allowing her a brief hug. The gathering was intimate. My brothers and their wives were there, along with their children. Brett's 3 kids played in the backyard, laughter echoing through the garden. Craig's wife, Allison, moved gracefully through the patio, helping set the table. My father stood as I entered. He looked older, frailer, The once formidable man who had commanded rooms now leaned slightly, as if time itself had chiseled away his edges. Hazel, he said, his voice raw and uncertain. Dad, I replied, nodding politely. The afternoon unfolded more smoothly than I expected. My nieces and nephews were curious, asking about my life in Wyoming. Craig asked questions about my agency, his demeanor surprisingly respectful. No one mentioned the gas station. No one brought up the 16 years that had passed, but it hovered like a faint echo in the background. After dinner, as the sky turned dusky violet, my father asked to speak with me privately. He led me to his study, a room that once symbolized discipline and cold business talks. We sat in the same chairs that had once made me tremble as a child. I'm not good at this, he began, but I owe you an apology. What we did, what I allowed to happen, it was inexcusable. I looked at him, seeing for the first time not the towering man of my memories, but a man brought low by reflection. Why? I asked, the question that had haunted me for nearly 2 decades. He took a long pause. My father was cruel. He called it tough love. I thought that's how families worked. I thought pain made you strong. It wasn't until you were truly gone that I realized how wrong I'd been. It wasn't a perfect answer. Didn't make it all right, but it was real. Um, More honesty than he had ever offered me before. I built a good life, I told him, tears unexpectedly brimming. In spite of everything. I see that, he said, voice trembling, and I'm proud of you. We didn't hug. There was no movie script resolution, but we shared a moment that felt like the first breath after surfacing from deep water. The next morning, I boarded my flight with a quiet heart. I wasn't returning home with wounds reopened. I was returning with peace. Back in Pennerage, my daughters greeted me with drawings and stories. Sam pulled me into a long embrace, no words needed. Later that week, I framed a photo of my daughters in our garden and placed it on my desk at the agency. Beside it, I placed the folded letter from my mother, not as a symbol of reconciliation, but as a reminder that I had survived, that I had thrived, and that sometimes even the most broken beginnings can still lead to something whole. I know, he said with a quiet nod. I've followed your company online. You've really built something remarkable, better than any of us expected. I let that settle between us before responding, my voice steady but measured. That was always part of the problem, wasn't it? Your expectations were never about who I was or what I could do. They were always about what I couldn't. His eyes dropped to his lap, the weight of years finally catching up to him. I was wrong about many things, he said, barely above a whisper. There were no tears between us, no grand reconciliatory hug, just the still, clear air of truth filling a space once crowded with denial. It wasn't cinematic, it was real. Two people acknowledging the pain between them. Two people daring to face it, if only briefly. When I boarded my flight back to Wyoming the following day, I didn't know if I'd ever return to that house again. I didn't know whether the fragile bridge rebuilt during that visit would hold or crumble over time. But I did know one thing for certain. I had confronted my past without letting it define or destroy me. I had stood not as a victim, but as a woman who had rebuilt herself brick by determined brick without the foundation she'd been denied. At home, Sam and our daughters welcomed me with laughter, arms outstretched and questions tumbling over one another. I was struck by the contrast, the warmth, the genuine love. This was the family I had chosen, the family I had created. Later that evening, as twilight settled over our backyard and the stars blinked into view, Sam poured us each a cup of tea and joined me on the deck. Did you find what you were looking for? he asked, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. I thought for a long moment, the cool Wyoming breeze brushing my face. Not forgiveness, exactly, but closure, understanding. The knowledge that what happened shaped me, but it doesn't own me anymore. The memories of the past 16 years drifted through my mind like smoke. The business I'd built from scratch, the family I'd built with love, the friendships grounded in respect and care, all of it had been born from a moment of complete abandonment. And yet, that moment had been the catalyst for my liberation. Their cruelty had unknowingly launched me into the life I was always meant to build. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to us cracks us open and the light gets in. Sometimes being cast aside is what finally lets you see the truth that your value is not determined by anyone else's ability to recognize it. To anyone out there still clawing their way out of the rubble, wondering if you'll ever breathe freely again, you will. It won't be easy. You'll cry, you'll rage, you'll question everything. But one day you'll look around and realize you made it. You didn't just survive, you soared. If this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it. And if you've ever had your own moment of transformation where pain gave birth to purpose, I invite you to share your journey in the comments below. Because sometimes the family you build is the one that truly sees you. And sometimes losing everything is how you find yourself. Thank you for walking with me through this story. I wish you strength, healing, and peace on your own path forward.